Take your Bibles with me this morning and turn them to Genesis chapter 37. I want to break down this morning's study into three headings that we'll work through systematically as we go through the text this morning. And I want to give you the three headings at the offset. The first is sin. The second is suffering. And the third is sovereignty. So sin, suffering, and sovereignty. And each of these headings will have a direct correlation to main characters in the text. And so I want to assign those main characters to their subheading right at the offset. So the sin will have to do with the brothers. So sin will have to do with the brothers. Suffering will have to do with Jacob. And sovereignty will have to do with Joseph, but primarily with God as the main character, main central person of this narrative, even though his name's not mentioned one single time in the narrative. So, three headings: sin, suffering, and sovereignty. Sin goes with the brothers, suffering goes with Jacob, and sovereignty goes with Joseph and God himself. So let's begin with the sin, which has to do with the brothers. I spent a bit of time last week seeking to persuade you to essentially dethrone Joseph as being a flawless, sinless individual in this text. The reason I did so is because I believe that's what the narrator is seeking to do as he introduces Joseph as someone who told an evil tale about his brothers. Tale is always used negatively in the Old Testament scriptures. And so Joseph is meant to be seen as someone who's been given an incredible revelation of what's to come and his involvement in what's to come. But Joseph received that not as a sinless man, but as one who was immature, naive, and sinful. The narrator, I don't believe, wants you to see Joseph at the outset as being a complete individual, but an incomplete individual, that God is seeking to do amazing work in making him a complete and whole individual through the pain that he's going to soon encounter and begin encountering in today's text. I think the reason the narrator does that and introduces Joseph this way is because he wants you to see the truth, which is God is the main character in Genesis, no single individual. So I've said numerous times, to approach Genesis by having cardboard cutouts of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph set up here on the stage and say, see everyone, we're supposed to be like this person. You would have a really hard time doing that in Genesis. Because there's a lot of times that this person, whoever it is, does some very unflattering things that they're embarrassed about. No, these men, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, are not main characters of Genesis. They're sub-characters. The main character is one and only, and that's God. So Joseph, as much good as we'll see out of him coming in the future, Joseph's imperfect. And I wish, looking at the brothers, that that's a truth that they could have chewed on for a bit before they did what they did. I think Joseph's brothers would have done well to understand that Joseph was just like them, except that God chose him for a particular event. Not necessarily because he was any better than them. He was a sinner just like them. But God had incredible things in his future. I think that might have helped them. But they chose to see Joseph in a total horizontal framework in which God had no part. And horizontally viewing Joseph, they saw Joseph in a competitive sort of way, in a race sort of way. So you got to ask yourself, in this text, does the narrator help you understand what exactly it was that they hated about Joseph? Well, the narrator makes that very easy. Joseph gets there, he gets to them, and the narrator gives you the verbs in very quick succession. They stripped, they took, they dumped, they sat down. So you just picture Joseph getting to them. They just pounce him, rip off his garment. Is he totally naked? Does he have anything underneath? Rip off his garment. They take him after they rip off his special robe, which of course he's wearing. They throw him in the pit. This pit was initially carved out to catch rainwater. The narrator points out that it's empty, which is kind of maybe just a foreshadowing of the fact that a famine is coming. Now, there's going to be good and plenty years before the famine, but you notice that the cistern, which was supposed to catch rainwater, is empty. There's no water in it. He's not going to drown. It's empty. They had to move their herds to Dothan to get there for the pasture, and so you kind of get this foreshadowing that a famine is going to come. But anyway, they take him, they throw him down there. Listen what they say in verse 19 as he's coming to them before they do this. Here comes that, what? Dreamer. And then they go on in verse 20 to say, come now, let's murder him, let's kill him. It's a very crass word. Let's just get it done. Let's murder him, throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams. So, twice, what do they hate about Joseph? They hate his dreams. They hate the double dream that God gave him, which ensured that it was going to happen. That's how they would have understood it. They hate his dreams. But what do they hate about his dreams? What they hate about his dreams is the status that he carries in his dreams. That's what they hate. They hate his elevated status. And what they particularly hate is his elevated status with the personality that he has at that present moment. And that we should be able to sympathize with it to a degree. If I'm right, if my interpretation's right of Joseph, he was a bit of a selfish, spoiled brat. He was a punk. He was insensitive, naive, just a bragatory individual. And when you pair that with this incredible revelation of his coming status, the brothers are right to look at him where he's at now in his personality and look at this elevated status and say, I don't like that. I don't like it. I don't like that this kid in his present form is going to get this position. I don't like that. They weren't alone. Jacob didn't like it either. When Joseph tells him his second dream, in which Jacob himself is going to be bowing down, it says that Jacob berated him. He got after him. Apparently, Jacob didn't like the way that he was going about it or the content of the dream. But then it says that Jacob pondered what Joseph said. You see, Jacob was able, as his father, to remove himself from competition with Joseph, which the brothers couldn't. They couldn't remove themselves from a horizontal view of Joseph. They should have, but they didn't. Jacob, however, was able to. And he was able to ponder what exactly this meant. Even though he's immature, what is God up to with Joseph? Could this possibly have any truth to it? And you see, friends, it's here that I wish men like Jonathan with David and John the Baptist with Jesus could have taken these brothers aside and said, hey. Before he gets here, Can I just talk to you for a second? I wish Jonathan could have sat down with these brothers and said, listen, just stop the show. Much better than Reuben did, who probably, I hate to say, might have been trying to gain back his status with his dad for what he did to Bilhah. It's possible that he wasn't. It's possible, I'm actually hopeful that Reuben was just a solid guy and wanted to do right by Joseph. But it's possible that even Reuben had an angle in preserving him. But I wish Jonathan could have sat down with them and said, guys, listen. I know Joseph's got his stuff. I get it. But I want you to know that there's a God. And this God has your good and His glory in mind. And it's just possible that God is going to take these dreams, which you see as inconsistent now, and so does God at this point. God's going to do something in Joseph's life that's going to make it's going to make you bowing down to Joseph someday the best decision you've ever made. You bowing down to Joseph is actually going to be the thing that preserves your very life and your kid's life and your dad's life. Just trust God in this moment. Don't trust Joseph. Trust the God of Joseph that gave him this incredible revelation. And just trust that it's very possible that God is able to make these dreams, which seem so unfathomable now, both actually literally but emotionally, and He's able to make it emotionally possible that you would want to bow down to Joseph and honor and respect him. It's possible. God can do that. Because I've seen God take a kid just around Joseph's age, and I've seen Him slaughter a giant, which I myself was scared to do, and He was able to do that. And I've seen God take this kid, this shepherd boy, and do incredible things with him. And I was glad to support him in that. I was glad to be his right-hand man. And it's, in some senses, even more incredible for Jonathan to do what he did, what the brothers didn't do to Joseph, because you see, Jonathan had a clear line to the throne. He's the son of Saul, who is presently king. Jonathan is next in line to be king. And yet Jonathan looks and he sees this David, and he sees God's hand incredibly on David, and he says, look, even though I have all rights and authority to the throne, I see God doing something amazing over here. And so I'm gonna get behind David. I'm gonna let David go in front of me, because in letting David go in front of me, I'm letting God's plan work out. And I want God's plan. I know David's a sinner. I know that. But I want David's God to be in charge. And so I'm gonna abdicate my rights to the throne, and I'm gonna let David take the lead. And I wish Jonathan could have talked to Joseph's brothers. I wish John the Baptist could have talked to Joseph's brothers. John was faced with an incredible opportunity for jealousy. He had been baptizing people in droves. People were coming out to him in the wilderness, in the desert, and he's baptizing. But then his disciples come to him and they say, John, we got a problem. All your followers, they're not with you anymore. They're with this guy over there that you baptized. They're all going to him. All. The word all is used. They're all going to him. I want you just to listen to John's response in John chapter 3. John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given to him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease. You see, I wish the brothers were able to, with Jacob and Jonathan and John view what was in front of them with a vertical perspective and say, look, I see God's hand involved, even though I see sin in David and I see sin in Joseph. There wasn't any sin in Jesus. But I see God in him. I see God all around him. And I'm going to view what's in front of me with a vertical perspective and not a horizontal perspective. And I am going to fall in line where God wants me to fall in line. Jesus effectively tells us to approach life this way. What does he say in Luke 14? In microcosm form, he gives us just a small example. When you enter a room, he says, take the lowest seat in the room. That's where you start. You walk into every scenario as you are the lowest in that scenario. Paul says it in 1 Timothy 1:15. He says, this is a trustworthy saying deserving of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, among whom I am the worst. This is the way that we're to look at life. But unlike that, all of Joseph's brothers were viewing Joseph as an obstacle to their superiority. They wanted the front seat, and Joseph was given it, and so they hated him. They're just like the disciples when John and James say, Jesus, can we sit at your right and your left? And John and James get the bad reputation for doing that, but the Gospels go on to say that the rest of the disciples were what? Indignant. They hated them for doing it. Why? Because they wanted the same seats. They're just as guilty. And so were Joseph's brothers. Self eclipsed God. Joseph eclipsed God. And what does the epistle of James say about jealousy and selfish ambition? Just listen, James 3:16. Where jealousy, and the text says they were jealous of him, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, so in other words, where those things are, what can you expect to cloud and circle and be everywhere else? Well, here's what James tells you. There will be, where selfish ambition exists, there will be disorder and every vile practice. In other words, if you're about to walk in a room and I say, hey, before you go in this room, I want to tell you what's in there. Jealousy and selfish ambition. It should tell you, okay, when I go in there, I should expect disorder and every vile practice. So you look at the brothers and you say, there's jealousy there, there's selfish ambition there. You see Joseph coming, and you say, what can you expect? You can say, I can tell you what to expect. Expect when Joseph gets there, there will be disorder and every vile practice. And Joseph gets there, and an explosion happens of fury, rage, and hate. It's exactly what you should have expected. And friends, don't think that this is isolated to some travel route town named Dothan. It happens in our families, and it happens in the church. The Apostle Paul will challenge the Corinthian believers as they're arguing over which roles in the church are more important, the seen or the unseen. They're prioritizing some roles over others, and Paul tries to come to them and he says, listen. God has given to the church every role that's necessary for the upbuilding of the church. Some roles are more visible, some roles are more private, but stop the grumbling, stop the competition, stop the self-loathing. You're all important. You all serve a purpose, but it's not a problem that one person's better than you at this thing. It's not a problem. That's a gift to you, because guess what? You have something that helps them. Just speaking with someone recently about the importance of coming to church. And the importance of coming to church is not just for you. It is for you, but it's not just for you. You're here for everybody around you too, because God's given you something to contribute. And what we have to do is we have to trust God's plan, and we ought to be sensitive and self-reflective and say, what am I here for? And then others reflective in encouraging others in the gifts that God's given them to bring to the table. But I want to stop a second, and I want you to see that these brothers were not self-reflective and they weren't others reflective. They were just self-centered. God was out of the equation, and so they didn't see Joseph as being able to benefit them in any way, and they surely weren't thinking of how they could benefit Joseph. I want to stop for a second. And this story came up in our Connect group, and it's a very wonderful illustration of how these brothers should have received the dreams that Joseph received. But I want you to see how counterintuitive it is. You might have remembered me telling you a story about a pastor who went to visit another pastor. And as he arrived at the pastor's study, he said to him, he greeted and he said to him, you know that this traveling teacher is coming through our area. And the pastor said, oh yeah, I knew that he was traveling through our area. And he said, yeah, I went to hear him speak. And he said, you won't believe what this traveling teacher said. He said that so-and-so, which was a mutual pastor friend of these two, he said that this so-and-so wasn't a believer. And the pastor, hearing that and sitting in his study, was baffled. He sat back and he said, that's impossible, that our friend isn't a Christian. That's crazy. That's insanity. Somebody's beeping. Figure yourself out there. So, and someone who's sitting next to them help them. So the pastor sits back, he says, that's crazy, that's impossible, of course this person's a Christian, of course this person knows the Lord. And the friend said, no, but I'm not done. He said, you're not a Christian either. And at that place, what would you think would be the response of this pastor upon hearing that news? Well, this pastor, hearing that this traveling teacher said that he wasn't a believer either, asked his friend to please leave so that he could consider this matter over with the Lord. Here's my point. The point is that's incredibly counterintuitive. You would think that this guy being accused of not being a believer would get more enraged, more angry. But instead, this pastor had a vertical dimension view of himself and what this man was saying. And he was saying, it's just possible that I'm not a Christian and that I need to deeply consider the truth and I need to consider this with the Lord. In other words, what he's saying might be right, actually. And it's sad for me to say that I don't believe any of the brothers looked at Joseph's revelation that way at all. Jacob did, but the brothers didn't. It's very sad in the text that it's very likely that the brothers, after selling Joseph into slavery, they take his special robe, they dip it in blood, the blood of goats, and they send it probably, instead of bringing it to him themselves. The Hebrew indicates that they sent it to Jacob on ahead of them with the question, is this your sons, not our brothers, is it your sons or not? You decide for yourself. And Jacob's response is, a fierce animal has devoured him, surely he's dead, is the idea. But what's interesting is that the word that's used when Joseph comes to his brothers and they strip him of his robe, that word is used for skinning animals. And then what's interesting is, what do Joseph's brothers do after they throw him in a pit? They sit down and they eat. Probably the food that Joseph brought, if he brought food to them. So you get this picture that the fierce animal or animals that devoured Joseph aren't animals, they're his brothers, is the idea that the narrator is probably getting at. But what I want you to see is what jealousy does. Jealousy and envy, they destroy and they devour, but they particularly devour not just the person to whom they're directed, but they devour themselves. You can only imagine that for the next 22 long years, the sin that these brothers had to carry on their chests. F.B. Meyer writes it this way: one crime may thus darken a whole life. There are some who teach that God is too merciful to punish men, yet He has so made the world that sin is its own nemesis. Sin carries with it the seed of its own punishment, and the men who carry with them the sense of unforgiven sin will be the first to believe in a vulture forever tearing out the vitals, a worm that never dies, a fire that is never quenched. These boys, these men, would carry their sin, and as we navigate through the future text, you'll see how this sin ate them alive. In fact, it's later in Genesis 42. It doesn't tell us in this text, but later when they're encountering Joseph, not knowing it's Joseph, they're saying, surely God is punishing us, for we heard him cry out in the pit. Just imagine the scene that they're eating their food and Joseph is begging them not to do this to him. And they keep eating. Friend, run from envy, run from jealousy, beg for a vertical perspective on your life. God is able to give you a life that's better than you ever asked for or imagined, but He might not have you be the center of that life. He might have someone else be the center of that life or that situation, and that's okay, because God's thoughts are far superior than your own thoughts. And maybe, just maybe, you were made to play second fiddle instead of first chair. Don't fight Him. Don't be, as Andrew Peterson says, on the run from grace from place to place like fugitives without a home. But that's who, unfortunately, the brothers were. So we see sin show up in the brothers. We see suffering show up with Jacob. It's unbelievable to me on how in this passage God ministers to Jacob through his suffering, and boy, did he suffer. But I want you to see that God had Jacob suffer in a corrective, disciplinary, loving sort of way. You might want to say that what Jacob did to Esau and Isaac when he stole Esau's birthright, that God dealt with that when he had Laban deceive him with Leah, and she was dressed up just like he was dressed up, and she came to him in the night like Jacob came to Isaac when Isaac was blind, and Isaac was drinking wine, and Jacob was drinking wine his wedding night, and so that probably blurred his vision to a degree. You might say, okay, God, you got it done. You showed Jacob what he did to Esau and Isaac through the whole Leah debacle. You've done it. You've checked that off the list. Now move on and let Jacob go. You've communicated to him the wrong that he did in stealing the birthright and doing it his way instead of waiting for your plan. Just let the guy go now. But God doesn't. Do you find it to be a coincidence that Jacob is deceived? First we see it, let me back up a little bit. First in the text we see his blindness. Where do we see his blindness? Well, it's kind of humorous that in last week's text it says that Joseph's brothers couldn't even speak what to Joseph? Shalom. They couldn't speak peace to Joseph. That's the context. That's the context we just came from. So what's Jacob doing in this text with Joseph, who's not working with the boys, by the way? He's just by his father's side wearing his nice fancy coat. And so he's sitting with him, and what does Jacob say to Joseph? Hey, Joseph, are not the boys working in Shechem? Go and see if everything is at peace with them. And so what you have here is you have Jacob being a blind father to a degree, not knowing that Joseph's brothers hate his guts. Peace is a laughable word between those two. Don't even mention it, but Jacob is sending Joseph to see what's at peace with the boys. So you have a degree of blindness on Jacob's part, but then Jacob receives a garment, much like Jacob himself wore Esau's garment. And what was involved in his garment? Well, what was involved was the killing of goats and him putting skin on his neck and his arms so that he felt hairy like Esau. And what do we find here? Well, we find a goat dying and being put on the garment. So again, God has found another way to remind Jacob eventually of what he did to his dad and his older brother. In other words, God is not finished dealing with Jacob for his previous sin. And I have to tell you that as Americans, we have a very casual view of God. I've counseled dear friends, or am going to counsel dear friends, that refuse ardently to admit that their life's circumstance and its awful situation has anything whatsoever to do with this dastardly deed that they did years ago. They don't see any correlation. But there's a direct correlation. God loves us too much to allow any remaining root of the previous sin to stay in our life. So He will gently and lovingly slap us with reminders of that sin to get it fully out of us until we're pure. You ever try to pull a weed and you just know, I didn't quite get it? You ever have that experience? It's just an irritating experience. You want it all. You want to know, that one is gone. It's never coming back. And that's how God wants our sin. And so He works, and He works, and He works. And He gives us reminders, and He shows the connections. I shared with you before that a dear lady shared with me that in her older age, God was reminding her of previous sins that she didn't quite even understand were sins of her past. But God brought them to her mind, and she shared with me that as He did, she just confessed them. And I see that as a beautiful picture of God getting her ready to meet Him face to face and purifying her all the more. And so, friend, if you find yourself in a similar situation of sins that you've struggled with in the past, know that God is lovingly curing you of that sin. But it's not just that sin that God's curing Jacob from. He's also removing an idol from his life. Do you remember when Rebekah, who clearly had Jacob as an idol in her life, and so she dressed Jacob up and said, come, I got a plan. We got to make this thing work out so that you get the blessing. And Jacob's response to her was, Mom, no, that's dishonest. That's wrong. That's theft. We shouldn't do this. Dishonor God. Why aren't you laughing? He says, Mom, Esau's a hairy guy. I don't have hair. How's this going to work? In other words, let's do this, but I'm worried about the details. Well, you remember that Rebekah says, Jacob, you got to leave for a few days till Esau gets over it, and then you can return home. And that few days turned into 20 years. And so God systematically takes Rebekah's idol and He removes him from her life. Probably she never saw him again. Well, now Jacob has an idol, and his name is Joseph. And do you know how long it is between the time Joseph goes on this short little 5-day journey, 6-day journey, before Jacob will ever see Joseph again? Try 22 years. Just about the same time that Rebekah didn't see Jacob. What's God doing? Well, not only is God reminding Jacob of his previous sin, he's removing an idol from Jacob's life. And we'd like to say that at the end of this text, that Jacob said, okay, God, I get it, I get it, I get it. Joseph was my idol. And you've taken him from me. And you're going to take your right place. And I'll see Joseph again when I die. But right now, you are to fill the hole in my heart that only you could fill, that I was trying to put Joseph in, but Joseph didn't nearly scratch the itch. And so now I understand that you're God, Joseph's not, and you're enough. Unfortunately, that's not how the text ends. The text ends by Jacob putting on sackcloth. If you want to imagine sackcloth, it communicates, I'm trying to find a similarity here. For those of you in the picnic, and we do the three-legged race, and that sack there, imagine wearing that with no t-shirt. It's not a fun thought. That's essentially the idea of sackcloth. It was inflicting discomfort, biting, one commentator says, biting discomfort on yourself. And the text says that Jacob put it on his loins. And normally, people would wear this for a duration of time and then remove it. So in the text, in the Old Testament, you find that when people mourn for a parent that passes away, the traditional mourning time was 1 week. So they would wear sackcloth and ashes for 1 week. There are anomalies to this. The Israelites did this for Moses for an entire month. But what does this say about Jacob for Joseph? It says that he did this public mourning for many days, the text says. It says that he, quote, refused to be comforted. And then he says in 37:35, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. In other words, the idol will remain resolute in my life until I die. Friends, I want to stop a second. I want to ask you, what sin is sticking around with you? What sin have others come and lovingly talk to you about that's still lingering? Notice verse 35. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Do you see the ripple effect of remaining sin and how it goes and it affects the ones you love? Listen to the words by Rich Mullins in Hold Me, Jesus. Surrender don't come natural to me. I'd rather fight you for something I don't really want than take what you give and I need. And I've beat my head against so many walls. Now I'm falling down. I'm falling on my knees. Friends, this is Jacob. Jacob will fight effectively for 22 years with this sin. You'll see it show up when the brothers meet Joseph, that Jacob still has this lingering idolatry of his favored son from his favored wife. And friends, I'm calling you to not be Jacob. Whatever your sin is, whether it's from your own lifetime or whether it's a generational sin that you learned from your parents, I'm begging you in Christ's name to let Him cure you of it. Or friend, you will be beating your head against that wall until you die. And I don't want you to do that to yourself. I don't want you to do it to your kids, to your friends. And God can free you of that, just like He's trying to free Jacob here. If you try to save your life, you'll lose it. That if you give your life to Him, you'll find it. God wanted Jacob to find Him. And Joseph was eclipsing Him. And so Joseph had to go. But if Jacob, I trust, had allowed Joseph to go to the peripheral and for God to become the blazing center, God would have been happy to give him Joseph. So that's Jacob. Suffering had a purifying effect on Jacob, even though it took a very, very long time. And then lastly, sovereignty. Take a look at Joseph and God Himself here. God's name, as I said at the offset, is not mentioned in this narrative. But I want you just to think for a moment. I want you to think as, sometimes as movies start, there's a subtitle sort of a descriptor that comes up on the screen to tell you about where this is at, what's taking place. And I want you to imagine that in this scene, this phrase or this line shows up on the black screen before the movie begins to unfold, and it says, "This took place at this time before the Great Famine." And or as some movies do it, they show you this incredible famine, and they show you Joseph taking care of people, but then it goes back to the beginning before the famine comes, something of that nature. And I just want you to do that for sovereignty's sake. I want you to think about that, and then I want you to go back and read all these details, and you got to say, man, God, if He's going to work within this framework, He needs to have someone from Jacob's family make it to the top tier of leadership in Egypt, which is miles and miles and miles away, before the famine comes. How in the world is He going to do it? And I want you to see every piece of this puzzle falling into exact place to get that done, to get Joseph in that spot. First, you got a problem. If Joseph's going to get to Egypt, he needs to get near, likely, a travel route to Egypt, which he's not near. So he needs to get somehow to this travel route. But Joseph isn't even working with his brothers. He's not even in Shechem. He's by his father's side. But all of a sudden, the brothers are in Shechem, and Jacob says, "Hey, Joseph, I need you to run in there and make sure they're okay." Remember, Shechem's the place where this bloody slaughter took place. So maybe he just wants to say, "Hey, are these guys okay?" So he sends Joseph to Shechem. Now, that's a 50-mile journey, and you got to know that when Jacob receives the bloody garment, he's not shocked, which means that for someone to get attacked by a wild beast on a 50-mile journey was not out of the norm. So, God has Joseph go to Shechem by Jacob sending him there. Jacob has to be oblivious to send him there, but he is, and he does. Then Joseph survives a 50-mile journey by himself, and then he gets there, but bad news, a problem in the plan. They're not at Shechem anymore. They're in Dothan, which is an additional day's journey, 14 miles, 64 miles away. And the narrator is communicating this in the text, that the brothers would have never killed Joseph when they're standing around the father. But 50 miles away from the father, 5 days journey away from the father, it's more likely. But they're not just 5 days from the father, they're 6 days from the father. So I just want you to picture, as Joseph's going, that additional 14 miles is like him swimming another mile out in the ocean. You're like, oh, this is really bad. He's away from the shore. He's away from Jacob. This is really, really bad. But how does he get to Dothan? Well, there's just this mysterious man that shows up in the text, which interestingly, remember the guy that wrestled Jacob? He was just referred to as a man. So is this an angel? Is it just a man? The narrator leaves it up to you. But he meets this man, and he says, oh yeah, I saw them. They're in Dothan. So he's going to Dothan. Well, somehow he needs to get sold into slavery or somehow get brought to Egypt. And the brothers see him, thankfully, from a long way off. And as they do, they have time to discuss what to do. First, they want to kill him. Reuben talks him out of that. But then Reuben disappears. And Joseph ends up in this cistern just in time while Reuben's away for this caravan of Ishmaelites to pass through just in time to sell him, just in time to get him on the road, just in time for Reuben to get back and say what happened. And just at the right place, with Dothan being the main camel travel route to Egypt. Shechem wouldn't have been good enough. It had to be Dothan. And friends, it could have been days or weeks before people traveled on that route. And it just so happened that the exact time while Reuben's away, for the Ishmaelites to pass, for the sale to take place, and Joseph gets his ticket to Egypt. And here's what I want you to see. This is so incredible to me. In Genesis 3, God hands humanity over to sin. He hands them over to it. And in doing that, He binds Himself to work within the constraints of sin. And what we see in this text is God using all of the awful sinfulness. Was Reuben all about himself? Maybe. Was Judah all about it? Was Judah trying to get him to get sold for free? Is this to shine positively on Judah or even negatively and show what an awful guy Judah was? In all this sin, in all this seeming happenstance, God is working systematically with every puzzle piece fitting perfectly together for His glory and their good. And friend, what I want you to see this morning is that effectively God is doing that in your life right now. All the stuff that you call good and all the stuff that you call bad is God perfectly orchestrating the puzzle pieces to form you into the image of Christ, which is the best possible thing that can happen. And here's how we can know that it's happening. Are you ready? At another time, God would send His own Son on a mission for peace. Just like Joseph is being sent on a peace mission, so Jesus is sent on a peace mission. Joseph's peace mission will end in peace, but it will involve his effective death. Selling someone into slavery was equivalent with death in the sense that you're stealing their life. And that's what they did to Joseph. But it will end in his figurative death. It will end in them sitting and eating with Him again in peace. And so with Jesus, He's been sent on a mission for peace, and at the hands of His jealous kinsmen, they will murder Him. But in His death, just like in Joseph's slavery, it will end in what will bring about ultimate peace. But friend, it's amazing to look back. And if you, as an interviewer, were to go along Joseph's side as he's marched away potentially naked into slavery at this point, and you were to say to him, Joseph, 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 what is going on right now? What's going on in your life? What do you make of this? Commentator Ian DeGuide says this, that not even the most skilled counselor could have explained what on earth God was doing at that point. And I say that to you because right now, and if not right now, in the future, at some point, that thought will go through your mind. God, what on earth are you doing right now? And God's answer always and forever will be, I'm working for my glory and for your good. Every single time you ask me that question. I'll ask you musicians to come.